Hello there. I finally watched the Channel 5 video with regard to Lucy Letby that came out. I think it was repeated, wasn't it? A few days later. But I don't have a TV license, so I watched it on catch-up. I wasn't aware I was able to do that, but just finally watched it this morning. I found it quite a difficult watch in terms of some of the scenes, particularly there's like the scenes of arrest and bits of the interrogation and things like that. I view it actually as sort of scenes of torture. That's the this system torturing an innocent person. That's how I see them. So I made some notes about it. I'm just going to go through it really. I won't go in that much detail, but I'll just do it. I'll do the notes in the order that I wrote them down. There was a little note I wrote in which they said in one part of the documentary that Lucy Letby was put onto day shifts in June 2016, but the actual month is April 2016. So that was just a minor error in it, really. I thought there were some very good contributors. I'm not doing it in any particular order, but Dr. Svilenia Dimitrova, the neonatologist, was just was excellent. You know, it was interesting that she did give her name, but obviously she would be known within the NHS and so forth, but she didn't want to be recognised. So that shows the kind of trepidation and fear around this case, but obviously very brave. When we later hear from Dr. Wayne Squire, a different doctor that's had very bad experiences from working for the defence on another case, and what can happen to doctors who do that. We can probably understand why Dr. Svilena Dimitrova is reluctant to be fully seen, but nonetheless she's put her voice and her name out there, which is very admirable for someone who's actually working in that system. And also there was an anonymous nurse that also gave a statement as well, a neonatal nurse, and her voice was, it's got to make you wonder, isn't it, what kind of systems are these? That the fear induced by working in the NHS, whether it's from the NHS and GMC in the case of Dr. Wayne Squire later, and any doctor that might go against the prevailing views on this case, a nurse and anyone else, in fact, they just fear retribution. What kind of grip of fear is there that would cause that? Well, we know the fear. Philip Hammond makes some really good points all through it. He seems to be like a spine throughout it, his contributions. Probably the person that's speaking the most, really. The psychologist, Dr. Faye Skelton from Edinburgh Napier University, I thought she was really, really good in just her overview of Lucy Letby's. She just basically showed common sense and just basic empathy, which was deliberately missing from the whole of the prosecution's case, of course, because they've got no interest in human empathy. They just want to win at all costs. Her assessment of Lucy, as a person, from looking into what other people said of her and friends, is just very down to earth and basic common sense, and plus this empathy. And more importantly, her interpretation of these notes that were one of the things used to damn Lucy, which should never have been anywhere near there, this in terms of evidence against her. It's clear, very, very, very clear what those notes are and what they mean. And they were private notes. They were meant for Lucy herself in terms of her working through, as I say, she's being tortured, essentially. She's under extreme stress over a long, long period of time. And it's obvious what those notes mean. I've gone over it many times in other videos. What else have I written here? Yeah, it's just very simple and clear, Dr. Faye Skelton. She's talking about a real person. She's talking about the person that Lucy Letby is, rather than this completely manufactured separate entity that's been created by, unfortunately, her ex-employers, the NHS, the prosecution, Evans, those ghastly consultants, the NHS as a whole, the police, the media, have created this completely separate individual, a fiction. They've created a fiction and put it in place of a real person. And really, really so good to see Richard Gill there, Dr. Gill, Professor Gill. And I thought it was very, very touching when he said the part where he says when the day in which Lucia de Berg was freed was one of the most beautiful days in his life. And I think I found that a very moving thing to hear him say that. And I think there's going to be another beautiful day for him in his life, and it's going to be when, well, actually there'll be many, many beautiful days, but in relation to this sort of subject, there'll be another one. And obviously he was very instrumental in Lucia de Berg and also the Italian nurse. I know her name, but I don't want to mess up the pronunciation. But he was so instrumental in getting those miscarriages of justice overturned. And as he is and will be in the case of Lucy Letby, Richard Gill will be. Really a heroic figure, I think, and a person of very, very much admire his dedication to all the cases he's been involved in, and he's deeply involved in this miscarriage of justice with regard to Lucy Letby. There's another statistician, I didn't write his name down, but he's made some good solid points. But I thought, what did I write here? There was a crucial point that wasn't really made, or wasn't made strong enough, that in terms it wasn't, and I'll caveat this with saying it's a 45-minute documentary. They can't get absolutely everything in it, and they can't go into super depth about any one thing, but I think they've done really well to get the main planks of things across. They're not going to be able to put everything in it. But back to that statistician, the point being, I think they did kind of suggest it, but it's who is making the decision about what is and what is not an unexpected or expected event, and what is a explainable or unexplainable event, and thereby what is a suspicious event, and what were their criteria. So what were their criteria to also decide what was expected and explainable? So this is a combination of the collusion that I keep talking about between Evans, the police, and those consultants, but then those consultants become consolidated with the NHS as a trust, really, then when they decide to go after Lucy Letby in a corporate sense, after certain managers trying to protect her from those consultants, and to a certain degree protecting her and upholding her grievance. But then they're turned on, aren't they? Tony Chambers and Ian Harvey are turned on as well, and they're forced out. And Lucy Letby has been forced out as well. So the people that tried to protect her are then also attacked, as you'd happen in the old, the Salem witch trials and other witch trials in Europe, as well as the American ones. People trying to stick up for people who are accused, and then find themselves accused, as we'll later see with a doctor that appeared for the defence in a separate case. But yeah, fantastic to see Richard Gill there. What else did I write here? Yeah, how did they deem all the other events non-suspicious and expected, in contrast to the ones that Evans has... I've gone over this ad infinitum, really. And then they get, how do the initial suspicions of the consultants get transferred and then ratified by Evans, the so-called expert? And what role did the police play in that transference. So there I'm talking about the collusion between the three parties to all get on the same page. And when you get examples where Evans can come up with 25 further so-called suspicious events, and they all get ignored by the police and the investigation because they're, for whatever reason, we don't know what the reasons are, they're just rejected. That's just another massive signifier of them all getting on the same page about what they can take forward and what doesn't work for them not being taken forward, even though it's the same so-called expert saying that these are suspicious too. It's so paper thin and so obvious what's happened here in terms of the corruption and collusion between the three parties. If he can get it wrong, as I said before in other videos, I don't want to keep repeating, but if he can get it wrong 25 times subsequently, what trust would you have in him? And if he's not got it wrong, quote unquote wrong, then why aren't they on the indictment? Well, I think the likelihood they're not on the indictment because Lucy Letby's not on duty. But then that reveals the con and the framing of device, isn't it? That they only an event is only suspicious when a certain person's on duty. And even if you decide that they're suspicious and then you find out they're not on duty, it suddenly becomes, oh well, it's not worth following up. It can't have been suspicious then because they're not on duty. Then that becomes the operable fact then. So everything gets funneled into which events that they can do somebody for, essentially, and then anything exculpatory or anything that confounds the idea that this expert's reliable in any way whatsoever just gets pushed to the side by the police. With the agreement of the expert, of course, the so-called expert, Evans. Oh yeah, sometimes there are some unclear statements made by the voiceover in the video from Channel 5 in the documentary, in which they say Lucy being on duty for, quote, all the deaths, end quote, all the deaths. But they're sort of, there's a lack of clarity there, so she's on duty for all the deaths that somebody has cherry-picked and created a subset of all the other deaths. And the choosing of this period of June to June is completely arbitrary. That's been created by the consultants in collusion with Evans and the police. It's a completely arbitrary period. What about the deaths that happened earlier in 2015? What about the August 2016 death? Why again, you know, the period's cherry-picked as well as the incidents, as well as the deaths and the crashes within the period. Everything's been subjectively cherry-picked, every element of this. Because across 2015, 2016, we're looking at least 19 and possibly more deaths. The reason somebody in the video, in the documentary, does say, oh, at least this number of deaths. The fact that they can't even ascertain how many deaths there were, that tells you something as well, doesn't it? I mean, I say at least 19 because I think 2 deaths that were, I've done videos about it before, of course, but 2 deaths that were eventually on the indictment as murders aren't showing as deaths at all in the Freedom of Information request. And I think they've been deliberately coded as stillbirths for some reason, and there may be more of those across those 2 years. So that means there could be more than 19 deaths. So the 7 murder charges on the indictment constitutes pretty much about a third of the deaths. So when somebody says in the voiceover of the documentary, Lucy's on duty for all the deaths, well, what are all the deaths? All the deaths are 21 deaths. So they're not saying that, though. They're only talking about the ones that she's been charged for. So the hospital will know, of course, you know, but we simply don't know how many deaths occurred when Lucy was on duty. We've got no idea. We've got no idea. The hospital will know because they've got her rota, you know, and a record of her rotas going on all through that period. But we don't know. The court didn't know. The jury never knew. Whether the defence bothered to find it out, I don't know. Who knows? Who knows what the defence did? So at any rate, she was only charged with causing 7 deaths of possibly 19 and possibly more. That leaves almost 2/3 of the deaths that she was not blamed for in any way whatsoever. So there's this conflation of all the deaths, quote, all the deaths that they say in the, rather than what it actually is, which is a cherry-picked subsection of the deaths, which is around a third of, I keep repeating myself because I'm reading these notes, around a third of the deaths over 2 years, but picked by whom and on what basis? That's the crucial question, isn't it? Not only why were certain ones picked, but the other part, which is, I've always put it in the terms of they're all in shadow, is why were certain ones not picked, on what basis? And that's what needs to be analysed as well by people with medical insight. And I don't think I don't think it is at the moment, because I don't think they won't have access to those other notes, will they? And who's going to have access to the notes of the second batch of medical notes that Evans was supplied, of 28 sets of notes from which he said there were 25 suspicious events? Nobody's going to be able to access those either, in terms of trying to undo this miscarriage of justice. How are we going to get those? They're going to just say, oh, well, no, you've got no right to them. I mean, maybe if there was a retrial, maybe they'll be able to get those, if that was a strategy of the defence, which it should be. It should be to look into every aspect of the reasoning of why Evans decided these cases and not these. So the not these ones are just as important as the ones he decided, because you need to look into, certainly also need to look into all these other assessments about suspicious incidents that were then disregarded, and why were they disregarded by the police? That has to be put before a jury as well if it's going to be a retrial. I think it should just quash the verdicts, of course, but we're dealing with a very corrupt system here that's got no interest in justice or truth. It's got no interest. It's just now at this point in time, it's just about defending itself. My screen is wobbling a bit. I'm just going to adjust it. Put it on a little stand today. So what the jury didn't hear about or any of the other deaths, just recommend Kerry Morris's video again that's on Daily Motion. I think there's a short version of it again on YouTube called the Other 15 Infants, which is a brilliant documentary that Kerry Morris made. Yeah, the idea of the injecting air into the stomach as a means of murdering is demolished by Dr. Svilyana Dimitrova, as other doctors have, as Dr. Michael McConville has, and other people, Dr. Scott McLachlan. And there's got to be more, and there will be more. This is what needs to happen now. It's got to, the Daily Mail called, Liz Hull in the Daily Mail said, oh, there's just a bunch of ghouls and misfits not accepting these convictions. But obviously, it's not just the ghouls and misfits. I'm just being ironical there, but it's going to attract, and I think it will attract more and more people that will just want to challenge everything that all the evidence that the prosecution brought here, and that's an ongoing process. And there are other people looking into further documentaries, I've heard, both in this country and abroad. And we're waiting for this second Guardian article, in which I think that's been held back perhaps for some legal reasons, as they're trying to work through what they're going to expose. They've obviously got people who formerly worked within the Countess of Chester Hospital and who are currently working in there, who are giving information to the media at the moment, and certainly have before, as we know from the New Yorker article by Rachel Aviv. There's lines of communication there, which is really helpful, isn't it? And I think that's going to increase as well as people get more courage to know that more and more people are saying it. They'll feel there's a safety in numbers, I think, and it'll attract more medically and scientifically trained people to weigh in on this. So injecting air into the stomach was the idea of it, through these tiny tubes, and also backed by Dr. Hammond in the Channel 5 video here. Evan's clearly not qualified in any sense at all to be the so-called expert, even though he doesn't want to be called an expert. He said himself, "Oh, I'm not an expert." He told the court. I was going to leave that till last, but he told the court, "I'm not an expert," and yet he's the expert. So there you go. I liked what Dr. Dimitrova said. It's hugely inappropriate for non-neonatologists to be giving evidence. And that's exactly what Evans is, a non-neonatologist, but also someone that had been retired from paediatrics per se for many, many years. And he said elsewhere, I don't think that much has changed, but I'm sure people in that speciality would have something to say about that. Nothing's changed in a couple of decades almost, so nothing's changed. Yeah, right. Dr. Shu Lee obviously comes up in terms of his air embolism paper. He's one of the writers of it, isn't he? And I'm just making notes. I'm just speaking these notes as I made them as I went through watching the video in parts. I watched it in 10-minute sections because I found it quite emotional and quite painful to watch in parts. It's brilliant that it's there. I just mean the parts in relation to telling the story and showing Lucy Letby being arrested and that sort of stuff. I found it's scenes of torture. But I just want to make the point again. I think I've made it before. I think that if Dr. Shu Lee could appear in the appeal for the defence. For the defence's case to bring an appeal, to ask for permission to leave to appeal, why could he not be? Why did the defence not call him for the trial? Why didn't they do that? Why wouldn't they do that? I mean, it's a 10-month trial. Could he have not have? I know he's based elsewhere. Dr. Shu Lee's Canadian, I think, isn't he? No, he's North American, but he's Canadian, I think. Why couldn't he have been? Was he contacted and said he couldn't? I doubt he said he wouldn't do it. Otherwise, why would he do it for the appeal? Was he just not contacted? So that's a sort of open question. Then they've got this guy, Alan Wayne Jones, professor in forensic toxicology, just talking about the so-called smoking gun insulin cases, that the immunoassay is just not sufficient. And he describes that a flimsy analytical result. It obviously should have gone to these more robust testing, as he called it, which is, I think, this colour spectrometry is one of the tests. It didn't do any of that, so those cases should never have got to a charge, let alone to trial, but there we are. But regarding both those so-called insulin cases, both the babies made a full recovery, but also one, we know this from other reporting in the Telegraph, I think it was, one of the babies had no symptoms at all. And both, this is crucial really, I don't think anyone made this point, but I've made it before, that I'm just saying because I'm just trying to relate it to other things, that these two so-called insulin smoking gun cases were never even registered within the hospital or by the consultants or by anybody there as what they're calling a crash. We know this because those two so-called insulin cases, and indeed the third one that Evans comes up with that gets dropped because Lucy Letby's not on duty. I mean, that just destroys it as well, doesn't it? The fact that there's a third one that they don't follow up. We've got two that look like we're saying attempted murder, and when we've got the third attempted murder, she's not on duty, so we'll let that one go. Oh, but couldn't it have been attempted murder by somebody else? Oh, no, there's only one. It's just insane, isn't it? It's insane. Well, it's not insane. It's not insane. There's method in all of it. That's that saying, it's madness, but there's method in it. I don't think it's madness at all. It's a construction. It's a framing. It's a construction. It's a way of destroying someone. Don't care what they believed, but, and their belief is irrelevant because they deliberately and overtly didn't challenge themselves in what they were doing, even though they had, masses of information and evidence showing that their hypotheses and theories were obviously completely wrong. So that's when it's all completely deliberate. That's when it's a deliberate, and that's what the collusion is. That's what the corruption is, and the fraud of it is. What was I saying about the insulin cases? Yeah, so both those two so-called smoking gun insulin cases were not registered as crashes at the time, or at any time. We know this because they did not form part of the 33 so-called cases of medical notes sent to Evans in 2017, nor were they part of the subsequent batch of 28 sets of medical notes sent to Evans in 2018. They were found separately by Breary, trawling through all medical notes, trying to find something to back up all these incredibly weak and, non-existent evidence, really. Air embolus cases and trauma and alleged trauma and things like that, and overfeeding, all that would never have stood on their own. And yet the smoking gun cases, as I've said lots of times before, wouldn't have stood on their own either. Would never have got to trial either individually. But somehow you join these two completely things that wouldn't fly on their own, and somehow this weird bird begins to fly and take shape and somehow flies through this utterly corrupt criminal justice system. That's what it allows it to fly, because it's a sick, weird, wicked system. A wicked system that has no checks and balances in terms of truth and justice. We know that because we've seen what they've done here, and they've done it many other times as well. And there'll be many other people in prison that are innocent. Not least some of these other nurses, such as Ben Geen and Colin Norris and others, I'm sure. I noticed in the Channel 5 video that some of the contributors, such as Philip Hammond and even Dr. I keep forgetting names, Dimitrova, they kind of weaken their input a little bit, I think, by saying, I'm not saying she's innocent, or I'm not saying the children weren't murdered, or something like that. Variations on that theme. It seems unnecessary to say that when they are at the same time, in the same breath, saying that there's no evidence of any value been presented by the prosecution. They're going further than saying, I think there's reasonable doubt. They're saying there's nothing, that it's either non-existent or completely implausible. So why explicitly hedge it and say, I'm not saying, everything's implausible, everything is unreliable in terms of the prosecution's case, the evidence isn't there at all, but I'm not saying she's innocent. It just seems a weakening, really. It's not to say that they have to explicitly then keep stating she's innocent. It's not about that. In the same way that the innocent person doesn't have to prove their innocence. It should have written, I would have kept that out of it, but anyway, they made those choices. Another good little quote from Dr. Dimitrova regarding overall the proposed mechanisms for murdering the babies are just implausible, and she follows it up by saying that's a very polite way of putting it. So she's completely damning it all, isn't she, as it should be, as many other people have since last August, and even during the trial. There's a voiceover which says a line there's voiceover in the documentary which says, the case is almost entirely circumstantial. I wondered about that, and I thought, well, why almost? Well, if you're saying almost, well, which bit is not circumstantial then? I think it is wholly circumstantial, and the circumstances are completely distorted and distorted by the prosecution and by the so-called experts and the doctor, everyone involved in it, to fit. So the circumstances have been all moulded, as it were, but it is wholly circumstantial. It's not almost, it's completely. Yeah, I'll go back to that point I made, because I just made another one about it. Some speakers keep saying, I've got no idea if she's innocent, or it doesn't mean Lucy Letby didn't harm the babies. I don't see the point in making this video and making statements like that when you're saying, I can't see any evidence that she did. Why would you do that? It's just a bit weak and a bit undermining and just unnecessary. Maybe they're just trying to set out their stall, that they're saying, it's got to go through a further judicial process to decide this. Okay, and that's all well and good, I suppose. If it was a decent system, yeah, it would be. But nonetheless, I just think it's just unnecessary. All the alleged mechanisms are implausible. The evidence is all they're basically saying it's crap, aren't they? And that's what Dr. Dimitrova is saying. It's a very polite way of saying it. She's kind of saying it's just all crap. They're talking shit. They're talking crap. But I'm not saying she didn't murder them. I'm not saying she's innocent. So they don't really go together. But as I keep saying, I think overall it's a really, really good start, this documentary. What's missing, as I think I might have mentioned already, is on what basis were the cases chosen? The subset of death, subset of so-called crashes. And by whom and by what means were the other babies' deaths excluded? So I've repeated that a few times. The collusive actions clearly at work between the consultants, the NHS, and the police is completely missing here. Maybe they just don't feel they can go that far. They don't want to make those charges because they'll have the NHS lawyers on them, and they're just, I can say these things here. It's different for them, I realise that. The aspect about the original postmortems being overturned, all of them overturned. Except why, you see, what about the postmortems that it was, the pathologist was Dr. George Kokai, I think he's spelled Kokai, and he's now retired, I believe. But in the babies, in the deaths, which again, as I say, is the preponderance of the deaths, perhaps up to 2/3 of the deaths in 2015, 2016, were there any postmortems done for any of those? I presume there were. And yet, is it that George Kokai, the pathologist, they're all fine? He can do it then. He can do the postmortems competently and effectively with all those ones. But the ones that Evans decides he can't, then he can't. Evans overrides everything, and he overrides it. He's not a pathologist, and he overrides the. It's bizarre. Well, as we know, it's all. Yeah, the doctor's being frightened about standing up against the mainstream view, that comes on a bit later with Dr. Wayne Squire, who was completely, had a career turned upside down and was stopped from practicing, taken off the register by the GMC, and then got her right to practice back after an appeal, but it turned her life upside down, as she said. They're frightened of being hounded out of their careers by it, she says, Dr. Wayne Squire. I mean, this just gives you a sense of the grip of fear that the NHS has over its employees and the GMC by extension, but the NHS certainly as well, that it's a place of fear. It's a place that people are frightened to speak, frightened to tell the truth, frightened to talk about their experiences, frightened to state their opinions publicly, because their employers will target them and bully them in the same way that those consultants bullied Lucy Letby out of the unit. She had the courage, determination to stand up against them, and they went further then. And that's a message to everyone else, that if you if you fight us, we'll destroy you. You know, I'm not saying every case will go to this lengths, but they'll do it in other ways. They'll just destroy you. You'll end up on, you know, the so-called island of lost souls. That's why when that, that horrible creature Jairam called it, you know, how many bullying victims are on that island of lost souls? Probably the majority, I would imagine. I've got a note here. Read the second batch of cases sent to Evans in 2018. Evans picks 25 from the 28 as suspicious, and yet none of those reach the indictment or are followed up by the police. Well, they might be followed up to the extent that they ask the hospital about the duty roster, and Lucy Letby's not on duty. So suspicious events cease to be suspicious when certain person's not on duty, but remain suspicious when they are. You can see the con of it, can't you? But, you know, on what basis were they effectively ignored? We need to hear that from the police. We need to hear it from Evans as well, because he's implicated in that. We need to hear it from the NHS. But also, what is the nature of those suspicious events? Are some of the quote-unquote attack methods similar to the other cases in which they were accepted? And if so, i.e., you know, deliberate feeding or this alleged forcing of air down tubes or injection of air by other means, and or trauma, physical trauma using implements or other methods, were any of those in those 25 cases chosen in 2018 by Evans that were all rejected? So, but we're not going to have privy to, we're not going to know that. How can we not know that? And I would have liked to think that, well, it's more than that. The defence should know that. The defence should have brought that up in the case and known every one of those alleged suspicious events that were rejected, and then taken those apart in front of the jury and said, well, here's an example of exactly what Lucy Letby is accused of in another case being rejected by the police, and the reason it's been rejected because Lucy Letby's not on duty, if that's the case, or for some other reason. But then what is that reason? We've got this idea of the myth of the stability of the babies that the prosecution and the so-called experts, hired guns at the prosecution, that kept on talking about all the babies are in good or stable positions, and the lying consultants stating that as well. Dr. I'm forgetting all these names, there's so many names, and Dr. Philip Hammond, you know, he kind of he covers that a little bit there, where he just says, you know, the vast majority of these babies are very premature, very, very low weight, extremely low weight, with a lot of other health issues right from the very beginning, right from their first breath, you know, and some conditions that the mothers had, etc. And some, he's sort of suggesting that some of the babies would have died, and I think likely even if they were in a level 3 unit. But we've got a level 2 unit here that isn't really operating as a level 2 unit and isn't able to, and hasn't got the staff ratios or the skill level and the environment for it, even in terms of it's cramped, and the incubators are too close together, so the infection control's out the window. Plus you've got the leaking sewage going on as well. And that's why you've got all these signs of sepsis throughout all the babies that were on the that ended up as murder charges on the indictment. So yeah, some of these babies may well have died in any way, and probably would have died, and certainly would have died in the Countess of Chester Hospital as they did. But they certainly, especially, would have died there because of all the problems, the chaos, as Dr. Alison Timmis says, the chaos. When you've got chaos in a system, and she said to Tony Chambers, you know, the outcome of this chaos is going to be the deaths of children, and also staff breaking down. She didn't imagine that one person would be scapegoated at that point, did she, Alison Timmis? And I don't think she was at the trial. I would have been good to interrogate her. Well, not interrogate her email, as it were, to Tony Chambers at the time, for the defence to do that in front of the jury, to say, well, look, jury, here's a doctor, consultant at the time, saying that this place is unsafe and is in chaos. Can we not consider that that's the far more likely cause of these deaths? Then it's coming up to 40 minutes. I might have to do this in 2 parts. I thought it would be quite a short video, but then I do rattle on a bit. But I might leave it. I'm going to do it in 2 parts actually. So I've got to this second bit here. Yeah, I'll go up to where Dr. Wayne Squire's experience. But there's another little note I put here, and it's with regard to the defence having Dr. Michael Hall there as a defence expert, a neonatologist defence expert, but deciding not to call him for reasons we know not. The defence, as they say later at the end of the documentary here, and as we know anyway, that they don't comment. They just won't comment about why they didn't call him. I've heard elsewhere, and I think it's from what Evans has said in one of his interviews himself, that he'd seen the reports written by what he described as the defence's expert, i.e. Michael Hall, and he went back and told the prosecution team, as it were, all the other so-called experts, the hired guns and the prosecutor, oh, they won't be calling him, don't worry about it, they won't be calling him. I can't remember the source of that, but it's from Evans himself. He went there, he had sight of Michael Hall's reports to some degree, or what I would have thought that the whole team, prosecution team, would have had the reports, but the way he tells it in this interview, Evans, is that he goes there, he has sight of these reports, and he reports back and says, oh, they won't be calling him. So what does that mean? What did he know to say that? And why? And they go on in the Channel 5 documentary to say that not only was Dr. Michael Hall not called, but his written reports weren't even seen by the jury. Obviously, he should have been a witness for the defence. But we're not allowed to know, or we're not being told by the defence why. They don't feel they have to explain themselves, I suppose. But it's a big question, isn't it? I think I'm going to leave it there, but I had no idea it would take this long, and I'll do it. The other thing is a part 2, because there's some stuff to do with Evans's written statements that are written at the end of the Channel 5 documentary. So I'll just finish it off. I think that'll be the shorter part. But I'll leave it there. Thanks very much. Take care. Bye-bye.